Hello and welcome to this digital edition of Melbourne Symphony Orchestra's Ears Wide Open, where we deconstruct well-known orchestral works to help you gain a greater understanding of the composer, the context and the story behind the music. My name is Nick Bochner and I'm a cellist with the MSO and also the Cybec Assistant Conductor. I'm here to take you through one of the most controversial and revolutionary pieces of music of all time, Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. The performance we'll be looking at is from July 2019, when the MSO performed this work under then Chief Conductor Sir Andrew Davis. Our Ears Wide Open program is proudly supported by TarraWarra Estate, who we've worked with to develop a perfect pairing of classical works with wine for a truly multi-sensory home listening experience. For more information, please see the link in the description below. In the history of all fields of human endeavour, there are moments that we can look back on and identify as being momentous and pivotal, moments after which nothing is ever quite the same again. May 29, 1913 held one such moment, the premiere performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Since that day, the Rite of Spring has been performed, examined, discussed, analysed, imitated, borrowed from, admired and feared. Even if you've never heard the piece, many parts will be strangely familiar. It has influenced nearly every composer of the 20th century, and most particularly film composers. Much of the music, now familiar as accompanying terrifying chases, strange creatures and alien worlds, has its one source in this piece. And despite 107 years of nearly constant attention, The Rite of Spring retains its power and freshness, both for first-time listeners as well as seasoned Stravinsky acolytes. Like most momentous achievements, Stravinsky didn't suddenly produce this out of nowhere on his own. Rather, in an astonishing and breathtaking way, he brought together the latest of compositional techniques with simple folk melodies. He used his knowledge of orchestration gained from his studies with one of the greatest and most conservative of Russian composers, Rimsky-Korsakov, to produce a new sound world. And this was all in the service of a vague story that, despite being ostensibly about pagan prehistory, managed to perfectly capture the temper of the tempestuous and rapidly changing world around him. Although Stravinsky was apparently disinterested in politics, it's hard not to see the Rite as responding to the events of the decade, the social upheaval, the Industrial Revolution, and in some way foreseeing the incredible, mechanised, savage self-destruction that was about to unleash itself in the form of the First World War. There was nothing about Igor Stravinsky's early life that suggested he would be any sort of revolutionary. He was the third son of a comfortably upper-middle-class Russian family, his father a celebrated operatic bass baritone, his mother a good amateur flautist and pianist. He admired Beethoven and Wagner and studied music with students of Rimsky-Korsakov. Having inadvertently given the young Igor a very good grounding in music via the household library and access to ballet and opera performances on a regular basis, his parents had thereby undermined their own aspirations for their son to find a safe, comfortable position in the civil service via a law degree. Stravinsky was just one of a number of composers who failed to complete a law degree. C.P.E. Bach and Robert Schumann are just two others. By the time he failed to finish his law studies, partly because of his own lack of application and partly because significant political unrest in Russia had closed the university, he was seriously pursuing studies in composition with Rimsky-Korsakov. The older composer was very supportive of Stravinsky and promoted his work where he could, which led to Stravinsky being commissioned by the famous impresario, founder of the Ballets Russes in Paris, and fellow law school dropout, Sergei Diaghilev. The Ballets Russes was a groundbreaking company that promoted artistic collaborations among young choreographers, composers, designers and dancers, all at the forefront of their fields, including Picasso, Kandinsky, Matisse, Ravel and Coco Chanel. The collaboration between Diaghilev and Stravinsky led in the first few years to the completion of three of Stravinsky's most celebrated works, The Firebird, Petrushka and The Rite of Spring, and was beneficial to both men. It allowed Diaghilev to position himself at the forefront of developments in ballet and gave Stravinsky access to a rapid rise to fame. In the days before film, opera and ballet were the primary multimedia storytelling platforms and, as such, held significant interest for the general public as well as for aristocrats and the elite. While the artistic integrity of the production was important, commercial and critical success were equally so. Diaghilev and Stravinsky were very much the Steven Spielberg and John Williams of their time, constantly searching for stories that would be recognisable enough to their audiences to find sympathy and interest, while at the same time having enough novelty and surprise to create excitement and wonder. Stravinsky's earlier orchestral compositions had been criticised in some quarters for being dazzling but insubstantial, a style in search of content. In producing the ballets The Firebird and Petrushka, based on traditional Russian stories, Diaghilev was aiming for a perfect combination of music, choreography and design so that Stravinsky had structure and substance to work with. In terms of specific musical material, the subject matter of these ballets sent him in an obvious direction, to Russian folk music. The resulting productions were miraculously successful with the public and critics alike. While working on the music for The Firebird, Stravinsky had the inspiration for another ballet, one based on a general idea rather than a specific story. He said later, "One day in 1910, when I was finishing the last pages of The Firebird in St. Petersburg, I had a fleeting vision. I saw in my imagination a solemn pagan rite, sage elders seated in a circle watching a young girl dance herself to death. They were sacrificing her to propitiate the god of spring." The resulting scenario is simple. In the absence of any specific plot, we find a very straightforward two-part structure, with each part consisting of a sequence of scenes. The first part describes the pagan world and its people celebrating the coming of spring. The second depicts the events of the young girl's dance to death. In depicting the ancient, Stravinsky takes the techniques he developed in Firebird and Petrushka of setting Russian folk melodies in a novel way to a logical extreme. Even at a time when audiences felt no compunction about booing or clapping at a performance to make their feelings about a new work clearly known, the reception of the premiere of The Rite was exceptional and has become the stuff of legend. It is impossible now to know exactly who was there or who said what to whom, but there is no doubt that Stravinsky and Diaghilev had managed to engineer the most significant scandal in the history of music. There is some evidence to show that Diaghilev may have orchestrated the seating, placing the Conservative Society set, more used to their stately Tchaikovsky Swan Lakes and Nutcrackers, directly alongside groups of bohemian modernists. The two factions clashed almost from the very start, so that for much of the performance, the noise was such that the music was inaudible. The choreographer Nijinsky had to stand at the side of the stage, shouting the step numbers to the dancers. Objects were hurled at the musicians and around 40 of the worst offenders were ejected. When the performance was finished, Diaghilev was reportedly very happy with the outcome. It would seem the idea that there is no such thing as bad publicity has always held true. The power of this music to shock comes down to 4 techniques. The first is to push us as listeners out of our comfort zone by using familiar musical elements in a distorted way. With his second technique, Stravinsky overwhelms us by layering elements in a way that goes to the limit of comprehensibility. Thirdly, he delivers moments of unprecedented sheer force derived from his brilliant use of the very large orchestra. And finally, most radical of all, he takes several fragments of music and switches rapidly between them, always altering their length and rhythm to create a mesmerising and unpredictable collage. The piece opens with the most famous bassoon solo of the repertoire. Famous because Stravinsky has the bassoon playing very high in its register in a way that it had never been used before. It's a peaceful start, but the sound of the bassoon in that register is so unfamiliar that we are already questioning what we are hearing. The notes the bassoon plays are derived from a Lithuanian folk melody, quite a simple tune that sounds like this. And this creates a sense of peaceful pastoral, but the accompanying horn part subverts the harmony in just the second bar. And when the 2 clarinets slide down a chromatic scale in fourths, we feel the initial sense of familiarity slipping away from us as Stravinsky's technique of distorting the familiar takes hold. After opening with the unfamiliar sonority of the very high bassoon, Stravinsky proceeds to feature the less well-known members of the wind family, the cor anglais, a larger, deeper member of the oboe family, the piccolo clarinet and the bass clarinet, the smaller and larger cousins of the standard clarinet, and the alto flute, a larger flute which has the quality of a wooden folk instrument. In this clip that follows, look out too for the piccolo trumpet, as the name suggests, a small, higher-pitched version of the standard trumpet. As the introduction proceeds, these instruments introduce melodies and fragments that depict the awakening of nature in the dawning of spring. The musical ideas are introduced in ones and twos against accompaniments that distort the harmony, before Stravinsky gives us his first example of the second technique, that of overwhelming layering, as all the elements that we have heard clamour for attention at once. They break off suddenly, leaving the solitary bassoon once more. There immediately follows another of the most famous moments in the work, an idea so simple and powerful that it seems quite obvious, yet nothing like it had been heard before. Again, building on the idea of distorting the familiar, Stravinsky takes two completely normal harmonies. We have E major and we have E flat 7, but he stacks them on top of each other. He then repeats them in a normal repeating rhythm, except that he throws in confusing, apparently random accents to create this iconic sound. Having established this energetic background, another tune based on Lithuanian folk melody appears. On its own, it sounds like this. But when put back with the stacked chords and confusing accents, it takes on a whole new meaning. After calming the rhythmic background, Stravinsky introduces yet another folk melody. And this has familiar, easy intervals. They're quite singable, but he plays it off against a totally contrasting fragment in the oboes and trumpets. And then he starts to build up the layers again to overwhelm us. There's another simple tune to listen out for in this section in the trombones. And also, listen to how Stravinsky starts to fragment the material we've heard so far and distribute it between the instruments to increase the intensity of the layering. It's not all layering and overpowering though. There are some sumptuous moments of repose. Here is yet another folk-inspired melody, still presented to be uncanny by giving it to us with the unusual combination of piccolo clarinet and bass clarinet. And then the melody we heard on trombones earlier is presented in a totally different context by flutes and 4 solo violas. The layering technique reaches its peak towards the end of the first section. These sections of overwhelming layering increase in intensity throughout the first part of the work to create an overall crescendo of tension. Here, each section of the orchestra has a fragment of music that they repeat, with the fragments having conflicting rhythms and different lengths. It's a sound that is still quite confronting, but at the time of the premiere, it must have been completely overwhelming. Once again, it is perfectly judged to remain just comprehensible to the listener and to stop just before it becomes unbearable. After the shock and awe layering that ends part 1, in part 2 we find ourselves in a sort of dreamlike trance. Here is another iconic sound, much borrowed from and copied. This eerie sonority is produced with the novel use of familiar things. The moving chords would sound quite at home in French Impressionism, such as Debussy or Ravel. And the underlying chord that makes it uncanny is simply a D minor chord, but together. Through this series of dreamlike dances, the sacrificial victim is chosen, and suddenly the whole piece changes direction, pushing inexorably towards the moment of death. The pivotal moment is once again a very simple idea, much copied, that has not been heard before. 11 violent chords relentlessly repeated. As we now enter the final phase of the story, the layering that in the first part had represented the surrounding earth and the power of the coming spring gives way to Stravinsky's radical collage technique, where he starts to use the orchestra much more in a rhythmic unison. It is, however, a very complex rhythmic unison, and this is where the driving power comes from. The basic idea is like this. Stravinsky gives us a fragment, and he lets us hear it twice, before starting to change its length by simply adding repetitions of one part of it. The effect is profoundly unsettling, as we can immediately relate to the rhythm as given, but are then thrown by its never being the same predictably. Stravinsky then starts to confuse us further by interpolating a different fragment into the repetitions of the first one. Then this new fragment starts to change length. It operates like a sort of musical cubism. From here to the end, this is the main driving force of the music, with some sections where the orchestra is used as a kind of huge percussion instrument. It's a piece that demands the most intense concentration from everyone. With unison loud chords and silences in between, making a mistake is not going to go unnoticed. Because of the unprecedented demands of the piece, the orchestra had 17 rehearsals before they even tried to join with the dancers. In a modern performance, we would have at most 3. Classical composition over the past century stands in the monumental shadow cast by the Rite of Spring. Stravinsky's complex musical collage and revolutionary approach to rhythm would impact an entire generation of composers who followed, from Boulez and Bartók to Steve Reich and John Adams. The Rite of Spring has survived one of the most tumultuous beginnings in music to claim a preeminent place in the symphonic literature today. And though it may not be as shocking now as it was more than 100 years ago, as you've just seen and heard, the Rite of Spring is still as intense and exhilarating as it was at its scandalous premiere. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Bochner, and I hope you've enjoyed this session of Melbourne Symphony Orchestra's Ears Wide Open.